our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. Today, we're going to learn about multiple meanings and coded language that newsmakers use to avoid responsibility for their words and to build rapport with their audience. Before we're done, you'll learn how they do it, why, and some ideas for how you might spot it when you see or hear it. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Before we get started, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about a report from the U.S. government on health. It was a Make America Healthy Again report that addressed very processed foods, pesticides, vaccines, and other things. And the paper that was issued cited studies that didn't appear to exist. Some experts have said that it was AI generated. And I thought it would be useful for me to talk maybe a little bit about the peer review process and what that means for the quality of work that gets released to you in the public. So here's how it works. Basically, someone who wants to do a study will come up with an idea, and they will collect data, and eventually they'll write a paper. There can be a whole lengthy process to go through from having the idea to having a completed paper, and this process will take a year or more usually. Once a completed paper is finished, the author's going to send it to a journal, hopefully to have it published. Now, the editors of journals are usually other faculty who have taken on these editing tasks. Different fields do this in different ways, and in some cases, journals will be part of a professional organization, and in others, they exist more independently. But the publisher of the journal really doesn't have very much to do with the process by which articles are selected. Instead, the person who's the editor of the journal will give it a quick read to see if it meets the standards for what the journal publishes. So, is it the right topic? Is it the right methods that they do? Those kind of things. And if it does, the editor will send it on to other academics who do work in a similar area to that of the paper. Now, the reason it's important to match the areas is because people who do work in an area are more qualified to tell if a study was good or not. I've never been the editor of a journal, but I am a peer reviewer. So when I get a paper, I'm usually looking for a few things. The first is whether the person who wrote the article has grounded their work in what is already known about the subject. In other words, is the stuff they're doing logical given what we already know? Are they asking a reasonable question? I then look to see the way they gather their information and if that's likely to lead to the kind of data that they need to actually answer the question they posed. That's called looking at their methodology, and that turns out to be really important. The type of process that you used to collect data, whether that was sending people a questionnaire or observing chemicals in a test tube or whatever, it can really influence the results that you get, so it's very important that you do that right. If all of that is good, I need to look and see if the way that they move from their data to their conclusions is also fair. Did they do appropriate statistical tests? Did they measure what they think they're measuring? Is the amount of conclusion that they claim a reasonable amount for the kind of data that they have? I'm going to take all of this thinking and I'm going to write up a pretty extensive report for the editor about the quality of the paper, and it addresses all of those concerns. And it's not just me who's doing this. The editor will have sent the paper to usually at least 2 other scholars in the field. Each of us who is reviewing will usually get between 3 and 6 months to fit this in-depth read of the paper in with everything else that we do all through the year. And it will then be in the hands of the editor, who will take all of the reviewer reports and will make a decision on the paper and if it can be published. Now, more often than not, the first time you submit a paper, it's going to come back to you for what's called a revise and resubmit. That means that you get a long list of all of the questions and concerns from the reviewers, and you're asked to modify the paper to address those concerns and then resubmit it to get considered again. And this can happen several times before a paper is published. It's not at all unusual for a paper to be in the editorial process for 18 months or more. So what does this mean for the research that gets published? It means that it's been very thoroughly vetted. People who know about the field have spent a lot of time and effort making sure that a good question has been answered in the best possible way. So, you can have some confidence that it's actually a good contribution to knowledge. In other words, that citation, it means something. So those of us who do research can get a little upset when people just make up citations that look real but don't reflect that entire process. And so that's why that government report has been so vexing for us. Okay, let's get on with today's major topic. When I was in college, we had a dumb little game that made its way through the music school. I showed up at choir practice a little early one day, and I realized I couldn't understand most of the conversations around me. It didn't sound like any language I had heard before, but both the people who were saying things and the people who were listening to them seemed to know exactly what was going on. I wasn't a music major, but it turned out that all of the music majors had learned a language game that changed English into something that people in the know could understand perfectly, but it sounded like gibberish to me. They called it offenglafish, and here's how it worked. You take every vowel in a word, and you add the syllable off before you pronounce the vowel. So cat has the vowel a in it, and before you say the a, you say off, so cat would be cough at. It can get quite tricky when you have entire sentences. For example, the opening line of this podcast is usually, "Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's UnSpun." In offenglafish, it would be, "Hafa lafo trafuth safi coffers, offend wafel kafum, tafu thafis wafix offen spaffen." It's a lot. It turns out there's actually a bunch of language games in different languages. One that you may have heard of is Pig Latin, and it actually works with a bunch of different languages. In Pig Latin, you take off the first consonant and you add an A and then slap it at the back of the word. So the word Pig Latin in Pig Latin is igpe atenle, for example, in English. But you can also apply those Pig Latin rules to other languages. So for example, you could arle pe en se frais or ekenspre oichte. Anyway, why would people come up with silly games like that? One of the reasons is because you can say things plainly in front of people that only people who are clued in your audience will know about. And that's the same idea as a dog whistle. In political speech, researchers refer to dog whistles as a coded message that most people would think is harmless, but it has a specific meaning for a particular group of listeners. That particular group is going to know exactly what the speaker means. And a lot of times, it's something that would be pretty controversial for the subject to say openly. Dog whistles have two important things about them. First of all, it may have a meaning that most people will use that is harmless and everyone would generally agree with, and that's usually the overt meaning. But it also has a covert meaning. So that's aimed at a target audience, and politicians do this because it's easy to deny. If people criticize that hidden message, the speaker can always gaslight them and say, "Oh, no, you're misunderstanding me." It kind of fits in the same category as saying something controversial and then claiming it was just a joke. So I have a couple of hypothetical examples for you, and then we'll look at a few real examples. Let's say perhaps we're all living in Gotham. And Gotham has a lot of nice things about it, but it also has a lot of issues with crimes like theft, and maybe it has a large invisible homeless community. So Sarah, a local mother, is attending a community town hall for someone who's running for mayor. The candidate takes the stage, and he says with feeling, "We need to bring back law and order to protect our hardworking families." Sarah's nodding along because she wants to feel safe in her community. But when Jackson hears the candidate's comments on the news later, he hears something different. So maybe Jackson works with at-risk youth in his community, and when Jackson hears law and order, he thinks about having city police perhaps searching his teenagers for weapons or drugs with no evidence. So the overt meaning of law and order makes people think of safety and rules and peace, and everyone wants safe neighborhoods, so this sounds positive and normal. But that covert meaning could be different. Some people might see law and order as a message that certain people, like maybe the homeless or maybe youths, need to be treated more strictly. It can hint at stronger policing or harsh policies that are aimed at particular communities without even openly saying it. So that's a dog whistle. Here's another example. Maybe high school teacher Helena is watching a Senate candidate on TV. Senator Cole is her existing senator and says, quote, "We have to protect our traditional values against those outsiders who are threatening our way of life." Now, Helena maybe lived in her town all her life, and when she hears that message, she thinks about all the things she loves about her town and about her state. She hears a defense of her community keeping their traditions and staying stable just the way she likes it. But maybe Mark's also listening. He's a retiree and he's deeply conservative. And when he hears the words traditional values, he hears something else. He thinks that the senator is implying that they're going to resist progressive social policies like LGBTQ plus rights or like programs that make it easier for immigrants to stay in their town. He hears the senator affirming his fears about how society is changing around him when the senator talks about traditional values. So the overt meaning from the senator is things people usually think about when they think about traditional values. Could be the way that their family works, respect for their neighbors, their community, and most people would support that. The covert meaning, though, is also important because for some listeners, traditional values can signal opposing new ideas like marriage rights for same-sex couples or policies that make it easier for people to migrate. Hearing the senator support traditional values could be a quiet reassurance for people who are listening who are afraid of those kind of changes. And the politician can then be saying, "I agree with you," without directly saying something controversial. Only certain listeners are going to hear those hidden meanings clearly. And it's not always words. Sometimes it's gestures. One thing that has a really broad array of meanings is the OK sign. This is where you take your thumb and your index finger and you make it in a little circle, and then your other three fingers are up in the air, kind of making a W shape. The common meaning in English-speaking countries and other Western cultures is that it means something is okay, right? Or it's good, or everything's fine, or it might even imply consent. When I learned how to scuba dive, I was also taught that gesture is used just to say everything's fine over here because a thumbs up means I need to get to the surface if you're a diver. It turns out that gesture has a really interesting history, including political uses as a support for Martin Van Buren, who was a U.S. president a long time ago. And maybe I can throw a link in the show notes for that. But this gesture can mean other things in other parts of the world. For example, in several cultures, it's meant money. In parts of the Mediterranean and Latin America, it can be a vulgar expression. And in some parts of the world, it has both a positive and a negative connotation, and you have to be looking at someone's facial expression to understand what they mean. In the U.S., the OK symbol is also recognized as a dog whistle. It's listed in the Anti-Defamation League's Hate on Display database. This may come back from an effort on the message board 4chan to convince white supremacists that the OK gesture could also be a white power symbol, with the idea being that the three fingers make a W and a circle, and if you kind of go down the thumb, makes it a P for power. I remember talking to a relative of mine about their kid who got disciplined at school for making an OK sign there because of this association. And that one is tricky because the OK sign is also part of something called the circle game, which is where it's a young teenager kind of thing, and someone will make that gesture below their waistline and they try to get other people to look at it. And if a classmate glances at them, the person who made that gesture gets to punch them. Very mature, I know. But should children be punished for making a hate speech gesture when they're just playing a game? Even the ADL notes that the symbol is, quote, entirely innocuous most of the time. And so that's the strength and the weakness of dog whistles. They're easy to interpret, they can maybe be easy to misinterpret, and easy to deny. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we're going to listen to several examples of speech that people have considered to possibly be dog whistles. I'll be right back. Welcome back. So, as we've already heard, dog whistles are speech examples that have both that overt meaning that everyone would hear and understand, and a covert meaning, which is a secret message to certain people in the audience only. Dog whistles are really challenging because it's hard for you to pin a politician down for saying certain things if they say it as a dog whistle. Let's listen to some examples. Here's an example from 1968. See if you could tell what people think was a dog whistle.
Leadership. Instead of becoming a great society, we are becoming a lawless society. Richard Nixon says there can be no progress unless there is an end to violence and unless there is respect for law. Nixon says the security of every American is the first business of government. All of our streets can be safe, must be safe. We can restore order and security under the law by firm, fair justice, by moral example, by respect. For times like these, Nixon's the one.
That was an ad from former U.S. President Richard Nixon. Law and order was a big centerpiece of Nixon's rhetoric. If you could see the images that went along with the ad, you would see that they included images of crime, the sound of the beginning being someone getting arrested, and images of people protesting. Nixon's been accused of using the concept of law and order as a dog whistle. People who say this kind of lump this in with the idea of what was called the Southern Strategy. And this related to a U.S. Senator named Barry Goldwater, who opposed the Civil Rights Act, which gave rights to Americans of different races and backgrounds. Goldwater's focus on crime was seen by some as a way to appeal to white voters who resisted racial integration. So, the Southern strategy tried to gain political support by tapping into racial tensions. And I will tell you that the perception that the Republican Party was using racial grievance to gain votes was strong enough that in 2025, the chairman of the Republican National Committee formally apologized to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People for exploiting racial polarization in elections. But this ad is also a good example of how dog whistles can be difficult to prove. Listen to Nixon here at a town hall meeting as he sought re-election.
Mr. Kinsman.
Thank you. Mr. Nixon, what would you do as president to bring law and order back to America, and what is your definition of law and order?
Well, let me start with the definition first. By law and order, I mean law and order for everybody. And let me lay one thing right on the line at the beginning. I know that it has been suggested that law and order is a code word for racism. I don't buy that at all. Let's understand that as far as law and order is concerned, that black Americans have just as great a stake in law and order as white Americans have. Fear stalks the ghettos as well as it stalks the suburbs. And we have to remember that when we think of organized crime, for example, it preys on the poor. The poor people, for example, they're the victims of the narcotics, and they're.
So what you'll notice here is that he is directly refuting the idea that he means suppressing minorities when he says law and order. And it's difficult to prove what someone meant when they're looking at hidden language. Let's listen to another example.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
That was former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who frequently used stories about people abusing welfare during his presidential campaign, a trope that they call the trope of the welfare queen. He talked about an unnamed woman who was ripping off the welfare system by using multiple identities to cheat it, getting government support without working, and just living a good life on the backs of tax-paying Americans. Overtly, it's pretty obvious that the story warns against tolerating waste in social programs. Who could argue with being careful in spending taxpayer money, after all? Covertly, the media and the public imagination often pictured this mythical fraudster as a black woman. Now, I think this is because, first of all, there was existing racial bias at the time, and there still is existing racial bias. But also, the media, when they run images to accompany stories of people on welfare, tends to show pictures of black and brown Americans much more than they do people of other races. And this is a persistent research finding. It's especially interesting because the majority of welfare recipients in the country are not black and brown. By using that welfare queen myth, Reagan could have been dog whistling to voters who had those racial biases, saying that he was going to crack down on those groups without mentioning race or ethnicity. This, again, is plausibly deniable, right? Because he'd always claimed that he was just addressing fraud. Let's listen to one more example.
The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. Looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots.
That was U.S. President Donald Trump speaking at the United Nations, and he was using a possible dog whistle of globalist. That term has been used increasingly lately, particularly by right-wing and nationalist politicians. Overtly, that would mean somebody who supports global cooperation. But several different sources I found equate that term with anti-Semitism. Writing for The Atlantic, reporter Ben Zimmer quotes the Anti-Defamation League's Jonathan Greenblatt as saying, "It is a reference to Jewish people who are seen as having allegiance not to the country of origin like the United States, but to some global conspiracy. I can also put Zimmer's article in the show notes, but he goes on to give a lot of interesting examples in the history of the term globalist being used negatively, and in particular to represent nefarious ambitions of people who are Jewish. So, someone who uses that term then could be giving a dog whistle to nationalist politicians and their supporters. So ultimately, truth seekers, recognizing dog whistles can be a really challenging task. But it's worth considering when those who seek to lead are trying to send different messages to different parts of the audience. Some things you could think about could be, number one, who the intended original audience is, and number two, what biases might actually be getting reinforced by these dog whistles. Okay, that's it for this week. I hope you have a great one and stay sharp. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.